Good morning, you beautiful bastards. How you doing? Welcome to the podcast. This is a longer podcast. It's about an hour long in total, and I just want to tell you what parts are in the podcast before you listen. So I start off by talking about belonging and fitting in, and I actually read a bit of an article that I came across recently. And then, of course, I dive deep into the vocabulary of the article. So overall, the first part is me reading and discussing some of the English that comes up in the article about belonging or fitting in. And then at about 23 minutes or something, I start talking about the English. And that's where the English lesson of this podcast begins. And in the English lesson, I focus on particular words, concepts, phrases, and of course collocations. So like self-fulfillment, shame-based, resilient, all of these words and like setting boundaries and stuff, I talk about those with real life examples, okay? And all of this is related to the theme of fitting in our belonging, okay? Fitting in our belonging. So I'm going to start with some questions. I have about 6 questions, and I just want you to think about them now. And then at the end, I'll ask you these questions again. So question number 1, can you describe a time when you felt a strong sense of belonging? What made the experience meaningful for you? Number 2, do you think it's more important to belong or to fit in a professional environment, and why? 3, how do societal pressures influence whether people try to fit in or belong? Can you think of any examples where societal pressures are particularly strong? 4. In what ways do cultural differences impact a person's ability to belong versus their attempts to fit in when moving to a new country? So important, that question. I love that question. 5. How does the rise of social media affect people's perceptions of belonging and fitting in? Do you think social media encourages belonging or fitting in, encourages authenticity or conformity? And 6, how do institutions like schools, workplaces, create environments that either foster belonging or push individuals to fit in, and what could they do differently? Guys, those are high-level questions. I'm not joking. They're all like C2 level questions. So put on your adult pants and try to answer those questions. I would recommend trying to answer those and then listen to the podcast and then try to answer them again at the end. So those 6 questions are all connected to belonging and fitting in. All right. Shall we get started with the podcast? Good, beautiful morning. What's up? You know who this is? I'm not even going to introduce myself. It was funny, I was walking through the hallways at work the other day, and I bumped into some of my old students, and they were mimicking the way I talk sometimes on the podcast. I'm going to say my name because specifically one of them said, "Hello, my name is Ronan, blah, blah, blah," or something along those lines. And I laughed, but it shows they're listening, which is good, and learning, hopefully. So hello if you're one of my students, my actual face-to-face students. Some of them have discovered my podcast, not all. Anyways, today, we're going to just do a little bit about belonging or fitting in. It's a random topic. It's a very strange topic, maybe. One that I wouldn't talk about too much on this podcast. But I wanted to choose something more interesting that has a lot of information about it. And I guess I got inspired by a textbook I'm using in class right now. And in the textbook, there's part of a chapter about the differences between belonging and the differences between fitting in. And it has like a good article to read. And I'm going to skim the article and just discuss bits and pieces of it before going into a greater discussion or a greater depth of discussion about the topic of belonging or fitting in. But essentially, the article goes like this. We all want to fit in, don't we? I remember how painful middle school was because my parents couldn't or wouldn't buy me the cool clothes for school that the popular kids were wearing. We were much too frugal for that in our family. Frugal. I love that adjective. We were much too frugal for that in our family. I was never one of the popular kids. Maybe those clothes would have helped, but in truth, I probably never would have been a popular kid anyways. I made friends and formed connections with kids who didn't care about popularity or cool clothes. Some of those people are still my friends today. Which brings me to the topic of fitting in versus belonging and how we can get from here to there. How we can get from fitting in to belonging. So that was the opening 2 paragraphs. I mentioned the word frugal. I love that one. Frugal is positive. Cheap is negative. If you call a person frugal, that means they're good with money and they don't waste their money. They don't frivolously spend their money. Oh, he's a very frugal person, but he's not cheap. He only spends money wisely. Now compare that to someone who is cheap. A cheap person will always avoid spending money. Even when it's necessary, they would avoid spending money. And they'll always go for the cheaper option, even if it's not the best option. That is cheap. Cheap is negative. Frugal is positive. And in this case here, the kid is remembering middle school. Middle school is like before high school, I believe. Middle school, you might be the age of 12, 13, 14 or something like that. That's what they call it in North America. In Ireland, we go to secondary school. We don't go to middle school. And we don't go to high school in Ireland. We go to secondary school. Secondary school encompasses everything, I guess. So a little bit different. But the kid is basically talking about how they weren't popular. How they didn't have the newest clothing line or the best clothes. And as a result, they wouldn't be cool. Was that what it was like where you grew up? Was clothing a big statement? As a kid, you think about it as a lot. I'm older, couldn't give a hoot. All right, so fitting in versus belonging. We all feel the need to be part of a social group in our communities. And we all make choices that affect the connections we make to others. At a young age, we begin to make decisions about our appearance, our social activities, and our time commitments. We choose how we look, our hair, our clothes, and even what we do to our bodies. We choose who we hang out with and how we spend our time. And in making these choices, we're either trying to fit in or belong. So from a young age, folks, we're making these decisions about what to wear, about what social activities are you going to do. Is that an activity that you want to do, or is it an activity that is popular and that's why you're going to do it? What is the motivation? What is the motive for you doing a particular activity? We choose how we look, our hair, our clothes, and what we do to our bodies. That might be a reference to hairstyles. Do you dye your hair? Do you shave your hair? Do you have a particular style that you want? When we talk about our bodies, do you have piercings or tattoos? And do you get them because you want them or just because you want to fit in? Bren Brown, PhD, a social scientist and a research professor, has been doing extensive research over the last 20 years on what she calls our true belonging. And what she says is the greatest barrier to true belonging is fitting in. So what are the differences between fitting in and belonging, my friends? Have you ever sat down and thought about it? Well, according to Bren Brown, the expert, fitting in is changing ourselves to match the situation. Fitting in is doing what the cool kids are doing. Fitting in is wearing the right clothes, playing the most popular sport, or hanging out with the best social groups. Doing something that is cool is fitting in. And of course, the consequences of doing that, you may have more anxiety, you may feel lonely, Fitting in is easier because you're not going against the norm. You're going with the flow. You're doing what everybody else is doing. That's what fitting in. But it's shame-based. And it sends out a message to young people that you're not good enough doing what you're doing or doing what you want to do. Because you're working to conform to others. And you're going to lose your real self by doing so. According to Brown, she says that we have a very deep fear that if we present our authentic selves, that we will not be liked. And in addition, young people who feel pressured to fit in ways that aren't healthy to their identity may end up participating in unhealthy relationships or just going with the crowd. They might begin participating in hurtful or mean-spirited behaviors, including bullying. So all of that is about fitting in, folks, that little part there. Fitting in is matching the situation, changing ourselves to match the situation. Fitting in is doing something that might not be what you want to do, but all the cool kids are doing it, so I'm going to do it. When I was a kid, so in Ireland, to give you a bit of information, there's soccer and then there's football. Football is Irish football, or Gaelic football, as we might call it. We're going to call it Irish football. I was never very good at Irish football. I was never really good at sports where I wasn't allowed to hit people, either like with a strike or just with my own body. And Gaelic football was not a full contact sport. It was physical, but not full contact. And I wasn't very good at it. I wasn't very good at catching the ball, wasn't very good at kicking the ball or anything like that. You know, that wasn't a sport we practiced in my house. We practiced hiking, camping, other sports like that. Swimming. But I wanted to join the football team because everyone was on it and it seemed like a cool place to be. But I was horrendous at it. I was terrible at it. And honestly, even when I went to the training, I never really enjoyed it because the comments from the other players and the coaches, they weren't very friendly at times. You know? They weren't very supportive. It was very shame-based. I'm not going to lie. It was shame-based, where they would try to motivate you by talking about how shit you are at something. But I still went because I wanted to fit in with that group. For some reason, I don't know why. Now, I didn't last very long. Less than a year, I played Gaelic football. And I realized this isn't for me. It's not for me for a variety of reasons. One, I don't like the sport. Two, I don't like the people I'm hanging out with. I really didn't. I didn't enjoy it. I didn't have fun when I was there. Now, a few years later, I decided to play rugby. And I belonged when I played rugby. I belonged with the people, and I belonged with the fun that we had. And the sport I was actually decent at. A very physical contact sport. So I tried to fit in by doing a sport I wasn't interested in, by hanging out with people who I didn't really want to be besties with by any means at all. But because everyone was playing Gaelic football, I was like, oh, I should play Gaelic football. Didn't enjoy it. Not once. So I was trying to fit in that situation there. I wasn't being my authentic self. Authentic self. What is your authentic self? Your authentic self is who you really are. What you really, really, really want to do is your authentic self. Your authentic self is you being vulnerable by putting yourself out there. But quite often, we're afraid to do that because if you put your authentic self out there, you're open for criticism, you're open for ridicule. And a lot of people can't handle that. You know, in that little part there, I spoke about going along with the crowd. To go along with the crowd. When you go along with the crowd, it's like mob mentality. You're just doing something because everybody else is doing it. You don't know why you're doing it, but you're doing it. And at this stage, you're too afraid to ask why. That is to go along with the crowd. It's not good. It could be incredibly negative, actually. And because you're going along with the crowd, you might end up doing things that you wouldn't normally do. Peer pressure is a big one. Peer pressure. Peer pressure is when your peers pressure you into doing something you don't want to do. Smoking a cigarette, graffiti, nick-knocking. It could be any number of activities that people want you to do, but peer pressure. So don't give in to peer pressure. Oh, he gave in to peer pressure. Peer pressure sucks. Write that one down. That's very important. So if you belong, you're going to present your true, authentic self. But that means you're opening yourself up to ridicule. You're opening yourself up to criticism. If you fit in, you're going with the flow. You're doing what the majority of doing. You're doing what the majority are doing, even if you don't want to. And this may cause feelings of anxiety or loneliness. So you could be part of a big group, but you still feel lonely, as opposed to belonging, which is something totally different. Belonging is letting yourself be seen and known as who you really are. About being true or being authentic. Belonging is wearing clothes that make you feel good or allow you to show your uniqueness. Doing activities that you enjoy. Spending time with people who you can be your authentic self around. Belonging brings enjoyment, excitement, or self-fulfillment. But belonging is not easy. Being different will make you feel vulnerable, exposed to emotional uncertainty. Brown says it's the same vulnerability that becomes the foundation on which courage is built. So when you start to open yourself up because you want to belong, you're building courage, and that courage will be the foundation for who you are. Like I said, it's a scary thought. Going against the grain. There's a good idiom. Go against the grain. Write that one down. But it's the same vulnerability that will become the foundation of courage. You know, Brown had assumed that belonging was external, that people negotiated with the groups they want to join. But rather, she found that the people with the deepest sense of belonging are those who had the courage to stand alone and risk being disconnected from others. I love it. I love it because I belong now. I'm in my mid-30s, and I know I belong. I belong with my group of friends, and I know who my friends are. They're weird. They're strange people, and I belong with them. That's a fact. I know when I was younger, I tried to fit in a lot. I tried to change to be with a certain group, and it didn't go well. I did not enjoy it. But now, and for most of my 20s, I believe, I got over it pretty early. Got over the need to fit in. And I started marching to the beat of my own drum, another great idiom. I started marching to the beat of my own drum, doing what I wanted, wearing clothes that made me feel comfortable, not stylish by any means. I'm not a very stylish person, folks. But I wore what I wanted to wear, and I found my group of people. I found my friends. I found my tribe. I found my community. And even in Canada, I found my community of weirdos. That's what I'd call all my friends, weirdos. Because we're different, but we have similarities. And this courage, I absolutely agree with Brown. The courage of exposing yourself will lay the foundations for the rest of your life. You know, that courage becomes the foundation of belonging. And everything must have a strong foundation if it's going to succeed. So the big question is, how do we get from here to there? How do we get from fitting in to belonging? Well, first of all, belonging is very important because it sustains healthy human development. Humans naturally seek love, acceptance, and connection. The majority of us, not everyone, but love, acceptance, and connection. You want to feel valued, needed for, cared for, and absolutely appreciated. And overall, humans who belong are more resilient. Resilient. What is resilient? Resilient is an adjective. Resilience is the noun. And Resilient is the ability to feel better after something unpleasant. To quickly feel better after something unpleasant. So something bad happens. If you're resilient, you get back on the horse and you continue. But if you're not resilient, you think about it for too long. It becomes part of you, essentially. And imagine like you're sick in hospital and a week later you're running a 5K. You're quite resilient. Or imagine you receive some very bad news and you get fired for no fault of your own. Do you let it get to you? Maybe for a little bit, but not a long time, because you're resilient. You're going to figure out the problem. You're going to take on the problem head on and sort it out. Resilient. He is resilient. She is resilient. Are you resilient? Are you able to quickly bounce back after something unpleasant, like a shock or an injury or getting fired? For me, personally, I feel I'm quite the resilient person. I've had many health issues and I've always bounced back in very good time. I've received bad news about things, and at first I let it get to me. But then I realized, why am I letting this get to me? Why am I letting this control my feelings right now? And I would fight back from it. So resilient. So how do we do it? All right. In this article, there's 3 ways that you can go from here to there. 3 C's. Connecting, caring, and coping. Connecting. Connecting is the experience of having meaningful bonds with others. Caring, however, involves developing empathy for others, especially across differences. Empathy will help us deepen connections to others who may also need support and belonging. And we'll talk about that a little more, but first, coping. C-O-P-I-N-G. According to Kenneth Ginsberg, a professor of pediatrics, coping is the act of being resilient in the face of stress, including the pressure to fit in. So coping is the act of being resilient in the face of stress. The face of stress. I love that idiom. Including the pressure to fit in. So, how are you coping? Coping would be, if there's a lot of stress coming your way, can you handle the stress or not? Because if you can cope with it, you're belonging, essentially. You must be able to cope if you're going to belong. Cope with being vulnerable. Cope with people judging you. Cope with being a little bit different to everybody else. That is coping. And if there's a bunch of stress, or if there's a bunch of people who are saying that you should fit in, you should stop being different, you should, screw them people. Screw them to hell. Because you're coping with the stress and you're more resilient. You're absolutely resilient to their words or their beliefs or their behaviors. Resilient to. Lovely, lovely, lovely adjective and a preposition. He's resilient to blah, blah, blah. Now the other one, empathy. Develop empathy. I've spoken about empathy before on the podcast. Not everyone has empathy these days. It's quite sad. Empathy is necessary. Empathy is when you're able to understand the struggles of others. Empathy is when you understand that you might not be going through what they are going through, but you're able to understand that it's a very difficult situation. You're able to share the feelings of another, even if you're not going through it yourself. It's the ability to take on the other person's perspective, to understand and to feel what they're feeling. That will be empathy. And like I said, not everyone has empathy today. It's kind of like not as popular. A lot of people are more selfish today and self-centered, and they don't want to help you because it's not affecting them. It's a very sad situation. Empathy. Do you have empathy? Are you an empathetic person? So overall, folks, how do you go from fitting in to belonging? Connecting, caring, and coping. Connecting is having meaningful bonds with others. Finding the people who you can develop a meaningful relationship with. Not a superficial relationship, a meaningful and a deep relationship with. Finding people who you can connect with and you don't have to change who you are. You can be as strange as you want to be with those people. That is how you can belong. So good company would be similar to connecting. Number 2 is caring, and that is developing empathy for others. Once you develop empathy for others, you can start to understand people better and you can increase the likelihood of belonging. And the last one was coping, like we just spoke about. The act of being resilient and the ability to bounce back. The ability to stay strong to what you believe in. And once you do those 3 things, you can hopefully go from fitting in to belonging. So fitting in or belonging. Okay, so now let's take a look at some of the English that came up. This is the English lesson part of this podcast. And we are going to start with cope. C-O-P-E. Here are some collocations with the verb cope. To cope. And to cope with is a very common collocation. And we cope with stress, cope with pressure, cope with difficulties, and to cope with loss. 4 great collocations with the word cope, with the verb to cope. So if you cope with stress, for example, she finds it hard to cope with stress during exam periods. He has developed techniques to cope with pressure at work. Learning how to cope with difficulties is essential for personal growth in life. After losing her job, it took her time to cope with the loss and to rebuild her confidence. After his father passed away, it took him a long time to cope with the loss. However, he eventually got there. So in this case here, we're looking at stress, pressure, difficulties, and loss. And I gave you 2 examples for loss. The first example was about a job. And yeah, after you lose a job, you have to cope. I don't know if you've ever lost a job. I can remember the first time I was fired from a job. I didn't cope very well at first. However, I sat down, had a good talk with my old man, my father, and I realized that, you know what, I'm better off without that job. So he helped me cope with the loss of my job. Another example, bereavement. And I've mentioned that one before on the podcast, bereavement. And a bereavement is when someone dies or someone passes away. And if there's a bereavement in your life, you need to cope. It's not easy. You know, suddenly that person who you relied on, suddenly that person who you loved or who you were very fond of is not there anymore. You need to cope with loss. It's certainly not easy, but there's different things that you can do. You know, some people like to go to a grave and talk. Some people like to cope with loss by getting really, really drunk, which is not really coping. It's kind of like avoiding, in my opinion. Sometimes you might go to therapy to try cope with a loss and to learn some different techniques. Now, in the first one, I spoke about to cope with stress. How do you cope with stress? How do you cope with pressure? Some people don't. Some people let the stress and pressure get to them. But if you have some techniques, what are they? Sometimes people will do yoga to cope with stress or to do exercise to cope with pressure. Like in the sentence 2, with cope with pressure, he has developed techniques to cope with pressure at work. Are you under pressure at work? And if so, what do you do to cope with that pressure at work? Do you have any tips or tricks that you could bestow upon somebody who is stressed or who has pressure at work? Some other examples of cope. To cope effectively and to cope on your own. Cope on your own. Sometimes there's nobody around to help you cope. Sometimes you have to help yourself. And if you have to cope on your own, you got to put on your big boy pants and get to work. You got to put on your big girl pants and get to work. You know what I'm saying? That means nobody else is going to help you. So you better figure it out yourself, especially if you move country. If you move to a new country, you're going to have to cope all by yourself. Is it easy? No. If it was easy, everyone would do it. Everyone would move country if it were easy, but it's not easy. So sometimes when you're alone, you have to cope on your own. For me, I might need to cope on my own if I'm hiking alone, or if I'm in the bush alone. If I'm in the mountains alone, I need to cope on my own, and I have to realize no one is going to help. So no matter what problem you encounter, you just got to cope. You just got to cope with it and get it done. The other example I said was to cope effectively. She manages to cope effectively in demanding situations. So she's developed some great techniques that really help her cope effectively. So there are some collocations with the verb cope. But now I want to look at coping, C-O-P-I-N-G, coping. And after coping, we have a bunch of different words. I'll read them out and then give examples. Number 1, coping mechanism. 2, coping strategies. 3, coping skills. 4, coping with change. 5, coping well. And 6, coping poorly. So 6 different sentences, all with the word coping. Now the first one, a coping mechanism. I love talking about this in class because it's always interesting to see what people use as coping mechanisms, and some strange ideas often come up. So if you have anxiety, if you have stress, what do you do to relax? What do you do to not let the stress and anxiety overcome you? That's the real question. What do you use as a coping mechanism? Now, sometimes people will smoke cigarettes. Not a very healthy coping mechanism. Effective, but unhealthy. Back in the day, you used to be able to smoke wherever you want. So if you were at work and you were stressed, you could sit at your table and smoke a cigarette, no problem. Today, you have to leave a building, go outside, walk 10 meters or something like that. So coping mechanism. But coping mechanism is something you do to help you cope. It could be chewing on gum. It could be taking a moment and breathing deeply. It could be taking a moment to look around your room and identify 5 items of one color. And that will help you ground yourself. It will help you calm down a little bit. So that's like a coping mechanism. Sometimes people will hold something in their hands, or they'll start pulling on something. That could also be a coping mechanism. Another coping mechanism that's quite popular is physical activity. I'm a swimmer, folks. I love swimming. And there's times when I was stressed or pissed or something, and I would just go to the pool and I would swim up and down that pool for 30 minutes to an hour. And afterwards, I feel great. Afterwards, I feel wonderful. It was a great coping mechanism for me. So during the summer when I was sick, I didn't really have a coping mechanism and it was kind of shit. So whenever she feels overwhelmed, she goes for a run as her coping mechanism. He does yoga. And it helps him release endorphins and to reduce stress. Another coping mechanism, journaling. A lot of people do journaling as a coping mechanism. And that's where they write down their thoughts, their feelings. And they write down what went well and what didn't go well, which is honestly a great technique for coping because it really helps you see what happened in another light. Like you're removing yourself almost, and you're looking at yourself, your behaviors, and you're assessing, did I do the right thing or did I do the wrong thing? So writing down thoughts and feelings can help process emotions and then provide clarity. Of course, you could also use substances like I spoke about with cigarettes, alcohol, drugs, food consumption. Oh, there's one I'm definitely guilty of. Excessive food consumption as a way to numb difficult emotions. Yeah, sometimes I used to do that, not so much anymore, but I would use food as a way to cope with bullying. I would use food as a way to cope with something bad that would happen to me. And as a result, I gained a lot of weight, folks. It's a real problem that people have where they use excessive food consumption as a way to numb themselves, as a way to cope. But it's not really coping in my eyes. It's just covering the problem. It's hiding the problem. So a few different things. All right, so let's move on now. And, coping strategies and skills and mechanisms. We kind of covered all of those there. Coping strategies, something you do to help you cope, and a coping skill, also something you do. So children need to learn coping skills. That's an example. So children need to learn coping skills to handle conflicts at school. And I'll tell you one thing, adults need to learn coping skills too. Adults. They really need to learn coping skills. And too many adults out there are unable to cope with rejection, failure, defeat, for instance. Now, when I was a kid, I played rugby, but we were horrendous for a long time. And I think we lost every game for like a year. Lost every game, didn't win a game. I remember the day we first won, and it was amazing. But by going through all those losses, we really learned how to cope with loss. We never gave up. It didn't piss us off too much. Yeah, we were disappointed, but we kept trying. I think in today's world, there's too many people who are unable to cope with loss or cope with defeat, and they get aggressive almost when they don't have it. Alright, here's a side note. The last thing I'll talk about with this. At the weekend, my wife and I were watching a movie called Speak No Evil. It's a new movie with James McAvoy. Now, if you don't want any spoilers, stop listening because I'm going to tell you some spoilers. My wife and I were watching a movie, and about 20-30 minutes in, she asks me, is this a remake? Turns out it was. It was a remake of a 2022 movie of the same name, but that movie was not American. That movie was Danish. So it's a Danish movie or a Dutch movie. I'm not entirely sure, one or the other, but it was kind of like distributed by Danish movies and then by Dutch movie theaters as well. And the actual name is The Guests. The Guests is the original name of the movie. So long story short, in the movie that we're watching, the 2024 version, the Hollywood version, you can imagine it was quite different. Now, European movies, say Latin American movies, they're brilliant, folks. The storylines are great. They always tell a story. There's always a shock of some sort, and it's not always a happy ending, for instance. But American movies, whole different story. There's always a happy ending, and there's always a hero. So we're watching the movie, and my wife, I can tell, is getting visibly upset about it. She's kind of thinking, what is going on in this movie? So the movie finishes, and I'm thinking, yeah, it was decent. It's about some people who are serial killers. They like to kidnap people and take their children. So it's a very dark story. But because it was made in the USA, it's very, very different to the original. So I spoke to my wife about the original, and she said I might not like it because it's very gory and gruesome once or twice, and it's a very heavy story. Long story short, in the original movie, everybody dies and the bad people win. And I love that shit. Because it's more realistic, right? So in the original movie, the parents die and the serial killers kidnap the daughter and take the daughter. In the original movie. But of course, in the American version, that doesn't happen. In the American version, there's a happy ending where everybody survives except the bad people. The bad people die. And as I was watching it, I was a little upset because I was thinking it was very predictable as I was watching it. I was watching this movie and there was no surprises. I knew James McAvoy wasn't going to survive. I knew the family were going to get away because it's Hollywood, because it's an American one. And after reading about the original one, well, the original film's director and writer, Christian Tavdrup, criticized the American version, and he said, I don't know what it is about Americans, but they are brought up for a heroic tale where the good must win over the bad. And this version of the film cultivates that. So I'll repeat that. I don't know what it is about Americans, but they're brought up for a heroic tale where the good must win over the bad. And this version of the film cultivates that. My wife had a very, very good take, a hot take we'll call it, on that in particular. So, the European version, everybody dies. in a very gruesome way. The daughter is kidnapped. They cut off her tongue. Yeah, it's fucking brutal, guys. It's a brutal, brutal part. In the American one, nobody dies. The family get away. The killers die, but nobody good dies. And there's a hero. There's always a hero. And she made a comparison that no wonder the country is so fucked today. When, if you grew up there, you're always the winner. If you grew up watching American movies and only American movies and American TV, you are always the winner. And there's always a hero. Like pure propaganda. But if you look at European movies, Spanish, French, Danish, if you look at some South American movies, the hero does not always win. The bad people win. Or if the hero does win, it's not a clear victory. Something incredibly bad happens. But that's not the same with American movies. And when the director said, I don't know what it is about Americans, but they're brought up for a heroic tale where good must win over the bad. Well, it really sums up why so many people are unable to cope with loss over there. That's a very big generalization and a very big hot take. But if you grow up in an environment where you're always the winner, where in every movie you're the winner, and think back to all the cowboy and Indian movies they used to have with John Wayne where he's always kicking ass, for instance. Think about all the superhero movies. There's always a winner and it's always good, good, good. Good will always triumph over evil. But that's not realistic. You're not going to develop the skills for coping when you grow up with rose-tinted glasses all the time. Now that's a hot take, isn't it? A hot take. A strong opinion. Something to get you thinking. Something some people may find controversial. But I would recommend, I kind of told you what happens in those movies now. I think the American version is an easy watch. It's decent, but nothing fantastic. I want to watch the Danish version, even though I've heard it's brutal. Another thing about it too, not related to belonging or fitting in, was James McAvoy is ripped. He's a big guy in it. He's huge. Apparently in the original, it's just like an average couple. They're not ripped, they're not strong, they're not muscular or anything like that. Anyways, coping is incredibly important. Coping will help you belong. If you can cope with all the judging of you, if you decide to wear different clothes and people judge you, and you can cope with that, you're going to end up belonging. It's like a hard journey to get through, but once you have the skills to cope, and once you have coping mechanisms, coping skills, coping strategies, once you have all of those, it's incredibly easier to belong rather than fit in. Okay, so let's move on and talk about self-fulfillment. In the text, it says that belonging will bring enjoyment, excitement, or self-fulfillment, but it doesn't come easy. And it is true, folks. Achieving self-fulfillment is not easy. Self-fulfillment is the process where you realize that you have achieved, you have completed your personal deepest desire and hopes and dreams and aspirations. Self-fulfillment is like a sense of completion, happiness and purpose. When you find something that you love doing, you will have self-fulfillment doing that. I'm a language teacher and I love teaching languages. And yes, there is a lot of self-fulfillment in my job, especially when students figure something out or when students do something or they achieve something. So self-fulfillment is when you have reached a state where you're fully satisfied with your growth and your accomplishments. So do you have self-fulfillment? According to Brown, if we belong, we will have self-fulfillment. And here are some collocations. You can achieve, you can pursue, you can seek, you can experience, you can lead to, or something can lead to self-fulfillment, and you can find self-fulfillment. So once more, achieve, pursue, seek, experience, find self-fulfillment, and something can lead to self-fulfillment. So a beautiful noun there, self-fulfillment. All right, another one that came up in that talk that we have been listening to was set boundaries. Set boundaries. And it is very important to set boundaries because, like, Brown discusses how setting boundaries is so vital for belonging. How you need boundaries because if you don't, you may overextend yourself. If you don't, you will start doing things for people when you don't want to, when you're tired, or when it goes against what you personally believe. If people do not set boundaries, other people will walk over them, and that's a fact. You need to set boundaries in personal relationships, sexual relationships, and of course work relationships. You need to set boundaries in all of these. In one of her books, Brown says, and I quote, "Daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others," end quote. So daring to set boundaries is having the courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. And that's a very important lesson. When you set boundaries, other people might get disappointed. And you know what? That's okay. That's their choice. That's their decision to get disappointed. There's nothing you can do. There's literally nothing wrong with setting boundaries, but some people might get pissed off. Some people might call you rude. Some people might say, "Oh, you're being a bit of a dick right now." When in reality, you are literally putting yourself first. You are literally looking out for yourself. So it is so important to set boundaries. How are you able to set boundaries, or do you set boundaries? Do you set boundaries at work? Maybe you can set boundaries in terms of what you talk about or what people know about you at work. You know, with my best friends, there's not really many boundaries. We talk about anything, we do anything, whatever. But at work, they don't know everything about me. And I want to keep it that way. You know, I've set some boundaries there, things I won't talk about, and I'm happy enough with that. So, overall, for you to set boundaries, it could be with a person. Maybe you know somebody who, you know, you're kind of friends with them, but you're not sure you want to be besties with them for some reason. Maybe you think they're a bad influence. Maybe you think they're a dickhead. And so you might set boundaries with that person. Like, oh, maybe I won't invite them here. You know, if they do come over, they need to leave at a certain time or something. That can be another one there. Someone overstays their welcome. You have to set boundaries so that shit doesn't happen. Set boundaries. Beautiful, beautiful phrase. All right, the next word is super important, and it's one that caused a lot of confusion in my language class. And it's called shame-based. Quote, however, according to Brown, it is shame-based and sends messages, especially to young people, that they're not good enough. And that was in reference to fitting in. Fitting in is shame-based and sends the message to people we are not good enough. So shame, S-H-A-M-E, based, hyphen, B-A-S-E-D, shame-based. And Brown argues that shame is the fear of disconnection. Shame is the feeling that something about us makes us unworthy of connection or love. It's really sad. And shame leads us down a road of behavior that will hopefully help us fit in rather than belong. All right, you got that? So shame is the fear of disconnection. Shame is the feeling that something about you makes you unworthy of love or connection or friendship. And thus, shame will eventually lead you to doing things that will help you fit in rather than belong. Quote, shame is the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging, end quote. And Brown focuses a lot on shame. She mentioned how it's a shame-based society. How if someone is different, people might criticize them. That's shame-based. I gave a great example to my students of Ireland. I grew up in Catholic Ireland. I grew up in Ireland where it was very religious. Not anymore, but it was quite religious. And I'll be honest, if people stood out, they were shamed for doing so. You know, if people wanted to be their true, authentic selves, especially in school and stuff, people would knock you down a peg or two very quickly, and everybody had to fit in. And it's true in all aspects of life, not just in school. But take sexuality, for example. Homosexuality was illegal in Ireland until 1994, I believe. Divorce was illegal until 1998. So, if someone was homosexual, they couldn't belong. They had to fit in and pretend they were straight. Because shame is a feeling that something about you makes you unworthy of connection or love. And in Ireland, if you grew up in the Ireland I did, you would have heard homosexuality is bad, the church is good, so on and so forth. And many people would have tried to fit in rather than belong. Now today it's different, and I'm quite happy about it. There's no shame around your sexuality today compared to the past. But there is shame in other aspects. So shame-based, a shame-based society. And shame prevents belonging, because shame makes you feel something about you is unworthy of connection or love. And that's BS in my opinion, but it's true. I hate it. I hate how that works because I really do not like shame. I think if people are trying to shame others, they need to get off their high horse and understand that everyone's just doing life the way they want to. So shame-based. Example number 1. Many people struggle with shame-based thinking, which causes them to feel unworthy or inadequate. Number 2. Therapist helped him recognize his shame-based reactions and encouraged him to develop healthier coping strategies. 3. Shame-based cultures often enforce conformity through fear of rejection or judgment, making it difficult for individuals to express their true selves. I like number 3. Shame-based cultures. Marriage is a huge one. Marriage. So often, people are forced to get married. So often, people are encouraged to get married. So often, people are told to get married to somebody they might not even love. And this is a massive part for a lot of my students, because I work with newcomers, and newcomers are generally coming from one society to Canada, where Canada is just so open, liberal, and accepting. And suddenly, there's no shame over here. You know, if you want to dress differently, it's okay. If you want to be attracted to that person, that's okay. If you don't want to get married, that's absolutely fine. And it does cause a lot of conflict between, if a whole family moves over, it causes a lot of conflict between the older generation and the younger generation. Because the younger generation are not going to conform to the older generation's ideas. Marriage is another great example. Like I just mentioned it, but mention it again because it's that important. Think about countries where the parents decide who you marry. Think about cultures where the elders decide who you marry. That could also be an example of a shame-based culture, because if you don't do it, you're going to get rejected. If you don't do it, you're going to get judged. If you don't do something, everybody in the village will reject you and judge you, and your life will become infinitely more difficult. That's what shame-based is. I have some friends that were in a religion, the Jehovah Witnesses, JWs, and they left the religion. But the thing is, it was a shame-based religion. Now, in the JW, Jehovah Witness, you believe that everyone else is wrong and that you're going to have eternal life and eternal salvation and your life is good as long as you are a JW. And one of my best friends literally believed all that when he was younger. And it was a shame-based culture, because if you questioned it, they might reject you, they might judge you. And long story short, my friend got out of the religion, got out of the shame-based religion. As a result, lost everyone. All his friends, his family, his support network, gone. So when he left the religion, he was literally by himself. He was fitting in when he was in the religion. But through fear of rejection and our judgment, it was very difficult for him to leave the religion or to be himself. Now, whatever amount of years later, he belongs. He's in a much better place right now. He doesn't worry about being rejected or being judged for who he is, because he has found a wonderful group of people around him, myself included. He has found a wonderful group of people. And as a result, he has left the shame-based religion, which uses fear of rejection and judgment and loneliness to keep you there. And he has found his true self, his true friends, and he belongs. So that's shame-based. I think number 3, my example 3, hits the nail on the head. Shame-based cultures often enforce conformity through fear of rejection or judgment, making it difficult for individuals to express their true selves. I'm very happy with that one. That's a great word. Shame-based. Yeah, not an easy one to talk about, not an easy one to remember, but I think we can all remember a time when there was some sort of shame-based thing going on. Okay, anything else in terms of English that we can talk about from that podcast? I mentioned an idiom, to go against the grain. And to go against the grain means to do something that is contrary to what's expected, or to do something a little different to what other people are doing. All right? It often involves going against the norms, traditions, or practices of society. So I mentioned in the podcast at some point, to go against the grain would be to do something unconventional, to do something that society would be confused about. So number 1, his decision to leave a high-paying job to travel the world really went against the grain of what people expected. So someone gets a good job, they got good money, people expect them to work, and then suddenly they quit. And it's like, oh, what's he doing? Oh, he's gone on vacation. Well, that's going against the grain. To go with the grain would be to keep working until you retire, die, and that's it. Number 2. Her unique style always goes against the grain, but it's what makes her stand out in the industry. So her unique style goes against the grain. Does your style go against the grain? I don't really have a style, I think. My style doesn't really go against the grain. But if your style goes against the grain, it looks unique. You are unique and you stand out. And number 3. It goes against the grain for him to follow the rules. He's always preferred to do things one way. It goes against the grain for him to follow the rules. He always preferred to do things his own way. So he goes against the grain. Or it goes against the grain for him to blah, blah, blah. And that just means it's something that he can't do. He's unable to follow the rules. So it really goes against the grain. If he does try to follow the rules, he can't do it. So he just does things his own way. So long story short, to go against the grain means to do something that is contrary to what is expected or accepted overall. All right. That's some damn good English right there, eh? Okay, my friends, so just to revise what this is all about, we were looking at belonging and fitting in. Belonging is when you can be your true, authentic self, and fitting in is when you change yourself to be part of a group of some sort. We spoke about words like frugal, resilient, shame-based, self-fulfillment, coping mechanism, coping strategy, coping skill. We spoke about peer pressure, or to go along with the crowd, to go with or to go against the grain. We spoke about setting boundaries, and we spoke a lot about Bren Brown, who is an author who focuses all about belonging and fitting in. We spoke about shame-based cultures, shame-based beliefs, and through all of those, through the content of belonging and fitting in, we learned what all of those mean. So I really hope you enjoyed this podcast, and you probably should go back, listen to parts of it again. It's a longer podcast, so yeah, I hope you got through it all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. You all know my name. It is Ronan. I have a Telegram community. The link is in the description. Please join. If you're feeling generous, do me a favor, buy me a coffee. I would say buy me a beer, but I'm off the sauce right now, and I'm really enjoying it. It's been about 6 or 7 weeks since I tasted sweet alcohol. And yeah, how do I feel? More energetic, less bloated, and more likely to make good decisions. That's the thing about alcohol. It's kind of an enabler to bad decisions, like bad food and bad habits overall. So I feel I'm getting some really good habits going right now, which is fun. But yeah, if you're feeling generous, you could always just, buy old Ronan here a coffee or a snack of some sort by going to my Patreon page. And I guess my dream in the future is that this podcast sustains me 100%. And yeah, it sucks that I have to ask people for it, but it is the business. So if you have money, that would be great. If you don't have money, do not worry about it, because I'm sure someone else will buy me a coffee. So yeah, that would be nice. Otherwise, I hope you're happy, healthy, all that jazz. And stay tuned. Let me know if you enjoyed this type of podcast too, where I read a little bit and discuss it. I did not expect it to be this long, but here we are. All right, folks. Have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.